Mr. Sioka here. Today we're going to learn about what causes demand to change. So let's get started. If you remember in our last lesson, we took a look at the chocolate bar marketplace in my classroom. And we saw that at various prices, there was a corresponding quantity that customers were willing and able to buy. And we saw that with the law of demand, when those prices went up, the quantity that customers were willing and able to buy went down and vice versa. And that's why the demand curve always slopes down. D for demand, D for the curve that always goes down. So the question we want to ask ourselves today is, are there things that could cause customers to become more or less willing and able to buy, not because of a change in price, but for some other reason? So let's get started and see what those things might be. Imagine if we were doing the same exercise, but all of a sudden, a big announcement came out the day before. It wasn't Mr. Sioka who was going to be doing the chocolate bar charity auction. It was going to be Tony Stark, Iron Man, or actor Robert Downey Jr. Well, often when you have famous celebrities being involved in these things, people suddenly become very excited and want to participate in it more. So if all of a sudden we knew that Iron Man was going to be conducting the auction instead of Mr. Sioka, maybe perhaps, if we take a look at that graph again in demand schedule, when the auctioneer said, hey, candy bars for $1, instead of people not wanting to buy any, they were willing and able to buy 100 because it's Iron Man asking them, not Mr. Sioka. And maybe at a price of $80 instead of 100, it ends up being 200. At 60 cents, instead of 200, quantity demanded is now 300. Instead of 300 at 40 cents, maybe it's 400, and 500 at 20 cents. All because instead of Mr. Sioka being the auctioneer ended up being a famous celebrity. So if I was to graph these quantities against those very same prices, notice what happens. At $1, it's now further to the right. At 80 cents, we're now further to the right. At 60 cents, the corresponding quantity is further to the right. And at every price, we see the corresponding quantity is now further to the right. So if I was to graphically illustrate this demand curve, I would probably end up with a demand curve that looks more like this. So if this was our first demand curve, this would be our second demand curve. And notice what's happened. The entire demand curve has shifted rightward. This didn't happen because of a change in price. This happened at every price. This is called a change in demand. More specifically, this is an increase. Up arrow always means increase in economics. An increase in demand. The demand curve shifted to the right. And when demand shifts to the right, that's an increase. Or what if the news we got wasn't so pleasant? It turned out there was some sort of viral outbreak that was traced back to some sort of E. coli outbreak in a chocolate bar factory. And imagine if this news came out just as Mr. C was about to auction off his chocolate bars. Well, suddenly you get all this news on your smartphones, there's tweets and posts, and you're like, oh, wow, where did you get those chocolate bars? And notice what happens. Previously, when I asked, who wants to buy at $1, the answer was 0. I would imagine it's still going to be 0. Maybe even at 80 cents, you're less willing and able to buy. At 60 cents, maybe instead of 200, it's only 100 people, the really, really, really hungry people who are willing to risk it. At 300, it's now only 200. At 400, it's now only 300. And notice what's happened now. The entire demand curve, if I was to plot the points, I'd be here and here, and let's see, at 40 cents, I'd be at 200, and at 20 cents, I'd be at 300. But notice what happens now when I plot the points of the new demand for the product. The entire demand curve has shifted left. Notice, when it shifted to the right, that was an increase in demand. But now it shifted to the left. And when demand shifts left, that is a decrease in demand. Again, notice what didn't change. The price of the products, or the possible prices, didn't change. What changed was the quantities demanded at every single one of those prices. And when there is a change in the quantity demanded at every price, we simply call this a change or shift in demand. So, remember what we said last chapter. We said that we tend to graph things relatively simply. We don't put a lot of hash marks. We don't put a lot of dots. We draft them very simply with straight lines in a principles of economics class. The graph on the left is the demand curve shifting to the right. This is an increase in demand, a graphical illustration of an increase in demand with the demand curve shifting rightward. And on the left is how we're going to graphically illustrate a decrease in demand with the demand curve shifting leftward. So the question that should now come to mind is, what causes these increases and decreases in demand? Well, the first obvious answer is clearly not the price of the product. Change in price, we moved along that demand curve. Change in some factor other than price is when the demand curve shifts. Right is always an increase and left is always less. So let's take a look at what causes these shifts or changes in demand. So, number one, change in consumer tastes and preferences. Changes in consumer tastes and preferences. Well, common sense tells you that if all of a sudden it became really cool to own a particular product, consumers' tastes and preferences would make them more inclined to buy no matter what the price was, and demand would shift to the right. And as something goes out of favor, demand often shifts to the left. We call these temporary changes in consumer tastes and preferences fads. But often these changes can be longer than just a temporary change. For example, one of the things we've seen in recent years is people consuming more white meat chicken and less dark meat chicken, because perhaps the white meat is considered to have better health effects than the dark meat. We've also seen changes in the demand for more products that deal with people who consume vegan or vegetarian products. We've also seen changes in the fact that the demand for wristwatches has fallen, largely because most of us have smartphones now, which also tells us the time. These are changes in consumer tastes and preferences. Number two, changes in the number of buyers. Changes in the number of buyers. Sometimes these changes in the number of buyers, obviously more buyers, more demand, less buyers or fewer buyers, less demand, can come about from demographic products. We've seen a markedly large increase in the demand for medical services, partially because more baby boomers, individuals who were born post-World War II, are now of retirement age and are consuming more medical products. In addition, there's often a huge increase in the demand for generators and plywood and other emergency supplies during perhaps a hurricane than there would be in other times. So, change in demand comes about because of tastes and preferences. Number two, by change in the number of buyers. Okay, number three, change in consumer income. Well, common sense tells you that if consumers have more income, and in economics we use the letter Y to represent income. Why? I don't know, we just do. So, generally speaking, when consumers are doing well and have more income, the demand for most goods and services increases. You're more likely to go on a European vacation when your family has a lot of income than when they don't. And anything that results in a decrease in consumer income, like perhaps a lot of unemployment or recession, would typically result in a decrease in the demand for many goods and services. Anytime you have a positive relationship between income and the demand for a particular good and service, we have a name for that type of good. That's called a normal good. A normal good. Now, the second type of good is what's referred to as an inferior good. Now, an inferior good might be something like, for example, if taking an Uber or a Lyft is a normal good, people tend to take more Ubers and Lyfts when incomes rise. Perhaps taking the bus might be an inferior good, in which when people's incomes fall is when the demand for inferior goods rises. And when people's income rises, people don't want to purchase inferior goods. They want to buy the good stuff. Therefore, the demand for inferior types of goods would shift left. It would decrease. Now, often students will assume that an inferior good means the goods of lesser or poor quality. And while that can often be the case, that's not necessarily the definition of an inferior good. A normal good is any good or service in which income and demand move together. An inferior good is any good or service in which income and the demand for it move in the opposite direction. While there often can be of poor quality, I'll give you an example of one that's not. The services of a bankruptcy attorney. Bankruptcy attorneys may be excellent attorneys, especially for the type of law they practice, which can be very challenging, but obviously the demand for bankruptcy attorneys tends to rise when people are struggling financially and consumer incomes are falling, making the bankruptcy attorney, by economic definition, an inferior good. Okay. Number 4, a change in the price of a complementary or a substitute good. Complementary goods are goods that go hand in hand with one another. Think paint and paintbrushes. Think an Xbox and Xbox video games. Those are goods that go together. Substitute goods are goods that take the place of one another. So that would be an Xbox and a PlayStation, or perhaps paint and wallpaper. Goods that take the place of one another. So let's say we're taking a look at two products, paint and paintbrushes. If all of a sudden there's a decrease in the price of paint, how would that affect the demand for paint brushes, even though paint brushes hasn't gone on sale? Obviously, you're more inclined to buy a paint brush when you've just bought some paint because they're complements, they go together. So in this case, a decrease in the price of paint would increase the demand for PB, a paintbrush. And if there was an increase in the price of paint, law of demand would predict price goes up, quantity goes down, and if people are buying less paint because its price is rising, what do you need a paintbrush for? So there would be a decrease in the demand of paintbrushes. Why? Because paint and paintbrushes are complements. They go together. Next, substitutes. If all of a sudden there was an increase in the price of Coca-Cola, what do you think would happen to the demand for Pepsi? Well, an increase in the price of Coca-Cola would result in an increase in the demand for Pepsi. Why? because the two goods take the place of one another. They're substitutes. The opposite is also true. If all of a sudden there was a decrease in the price of Coca-Cola, well, we would move along the Coca-Cola demand curve. There'd be no shift of Coca-Cola. But if this graph was Pepsi, we would shift the Pepsi curve to the left. There'd be a decrease in the demand for Pepsi. Why? Because people would go buy the Coke because it's on sale. And as a result, the demand for Pepsi would fall, even though Pepsi's price hadn't changed. Okay, so let's review. We've covered change in consumer tastes and preferences. We've covered change in the number of buyers. We've covered what happens to demand when there's a change in consumer incomes. Normal and inferior goods react differently. We've seen what happens not when there's a change in the price of the product, but a change in the price of a complementary good, something that goes with the product, or a substitute good, something that takes the place of the product. The last one is a change in consumer expectations. Okay, well, imagine you're sitting on your couch and you're thinking about going down to the local store to purchase one of those big, brand new, flat screen, humongous 90-inch televisions. And you've been thinking about doing it. And all of a sudden you get a phone call from a friend of yours that works at one of those big giant stores and says, hey, I know you've been thinking about buying one of those TVs. I just wanted you to know, I heard from managers, it's going to be going on sale in 2 weeks. Well, if you have an expectation that price is going to go down in the future, it hasn't changed yet, so there is no movement along the demand curve. But if you expect there to be a decrease in price in the future, you expect its price to fall. Well, common sense tells you, don't go buy it now, wait. And as a result, there's a decrease in demand now. Conversely, if your friend called you up and you're sitting on your couch kind of on the fence going, do I go get it now? Do I wait? What should I do? And your friend calls you up and says, hey, we just found out in 2 weeks the price is going to be going up by $300. Well, that would probably get most people to get off the couch and go buy it now because they know if they wait, it's going to be more expensive. So that if you expect an increase in price in the future, that's an incentive to want to go out and purchase more of it now. Demand increases. So, to summarize, things that we've learned in the last 2 chapters. When there's a change in a product's price, there's movement along the demand curve. So notice, this is price falling, quantity rising. This is price rising, quantity falling. Change in price, and we moved along the demand curve. Change in price, and we moved along the demand curve. But sometimes other than a product's price will be the item changing. And when those 5 things happened, we don't move along a demand curve. That would be an increase or a decrease in demand. And when that happens, the demand curve shifts. To the right is an increase in demand. To the left is a decrease in demand. Okay, so I'm going to number these graphs. 1, 2, graph 3, and graph 4. And here's the question I have for you. Which one of these 4 graphs illustrate customers more willing and able to buy? Which one of these 4 graphs? Is it graph 1, graph 2, graph 3, or graph 4? Did you pick one? Okay. All right. Sadly, this is a trick question. The answer is graphs 1 and graphs 3. Both graphs 1 and graph 3 illustrate customers whose state of mind has changed and made them more willing and able to buy. But the difference between graph 1 and graph 3 is the reason why the customers are more willing and able to buy. Graph 1 illustrates a customer more willing and able to buy because the product's price has gone down. Graph 3 illustrates a customer more willing and able to buy no matter what the price is or was. They're more willing and able to buy at every price because some factor other than price has changed. Some factor other than price. Also, 2 and 4 both represent consumers who are less willing and able to buy. But again, the difference is the reason why they're less willing and able to buy. Graph 2 illustrates consumers less willing and able to buy because the product's price has gone up. Graph 4 represents customers who are less willing and able to buy at every price. Well, I hope you found this helpful, and until next video, bye.